This episode, titled Requiem for Methusela, premiered in Season 3. It was written by Jerome Bixby and directed by Murray Golden. It was episode 19 and first aired on February 13th of 1969. The episode was produced by Fred Freeberger, and the associate producers were Edward K. Milkis and Greg Peters. Special guest stars were James Daly as Mr. Flint and Louise Sorrell as Raina. An interesting side note about this episode is that it would show the 3-foot miniature model of the USS Enterprise that belonged to Gene Roddenberry. For a little more information on that actual model, I've done a video updating the status of the lost piece as of 2023. On Stardate 5843.7, the Enterprise is in the midst of an epidemic. Rigelian fever has broken out aboard ship. It has already claimed the lives of 3 crewmen and afflicted 23 more. Dr. McCoy would need large quantities of Ritalin to process into an antitoxin for the Rigelian fever. Dr. McCoy, Mr. Spock, and Captain Kirk would beam down to a small planet in the Omega system, later to be identified as Hallberg 917G. The Ritalin was detected on the planet's surface. Once on the planet, Dr. McCoy's tricorder would indicate that there would be a large deposit of Ritalin bearing 2734 kilometers away. Dr. McCoy would warn the captain that we had a maximum window of 4 hours to process the raw Ritalin into the serum for the antidote before the disease became irreversible and fatal to the crew. Mr. Spock would inform Dr. McCoy and Captain Kirk that his tricorder was picking up a life form, even though the Enterprise sensors showed the planet to be devoid of life forms and uninhabited. That is when a landing party would be introduced to an electronic unit known as M4. It would proceed to fire energy beams just in front of them to their left. Captain Kirk then realized that their phasers were inoperable. Then another beam shot onto the left side of the landing party as they backed off. That is when a male voice would call out, "Do not kill." After that was said, the M4 would back away from the landing party. The landing party would then be introduced to a Mr. Flint. Captain Kirk would introduce himself, and Flint would say that he already knew who he was and the purpose of their mission because he was monitoring their signals. He then demanded for the landing party to leave his planet, and would go on to say that the planet was his retreat from the unpleasantness of Earth and the company of people. Captain Kirk would plead his case, stating that he had a sick crew that was in need of the Ritalin to cure them. He also said that the Enterprise couldn't possibly get to another planet in time to save the crew. Flint said that he still wanted them to leave. Captain Kirk said that they would purchase it, work for it, or even trade for it. Flint responded, stating that there was nothing that he wanted from them. In a desperate attempt to get the Ritalin, Captain Kirk stated that if it were necessary, they would take it. Flint restated that he wanted the landing party and the Enterprise to leave, stating that he did in fact have the power to force them away. He even threatened the landing party by stating that he could kill them where they stood. Once Captain Kirk heard the threat, he would immediately contact the Enterprise and inform Mr. Scott to lock phasers on their location. Captain Kirk informed Flint that if anything should happen to them, there would be 4 deaths, meaning the landing party and Mr. Flint. He then went on to say that his crew would still come down and take the Ritalin. Flint would go on to say, "What an interesting test of powers. The mighty force of the Enterprise against his forces." Flint would say, "Who would win?" Mr. Spock would interject with the following, "Unless you are certain, I must suggest you refrain from a most useless experiment." Dr. McCoy would ask Flint if he had ever seen the effects of Rigelian fever, and that it was similar to the bubonic plague. Upon hearing this, Flint noticeably expressed almost a pain expression on his face. He then stated, "Constantinople, summer 1334. It marched through the street, the sewers. It left the city by ox cart, by sea, to kill half of Europe. The rats squealing and bustling of the night as they too died. Again, Flint would present an expression of pain on his face. Mr. Spock would inquire if he was a student of history, and Flint would simply say, "I am." He went on to say that the Enterprise was a plague ship, and they had 2 hours to gather the Ritalin they needed, and they must leave. Captain Kirk would add, with all due gratitude. Flint told the landing party that the M4 unit could gather the Ritalin they needed. With that, the M4 unit would leave and gather the precious commodity for the Enterprise crew. Flint's demeanor then changed as he stated to the landing party, "Permit me to offer more comfortable surroundings." Flint would lead the landing party to a magnificent castle-like structure. Upon entry, Mr. Spock said to Flint that the sensors did not register any life forms. Flint would tell Mr. Spock that he had a special shield on the planet to hide his presence. Protection against the curious or the uninvited. Spock said, "So you live here alone?" And Flint would reply, "Except for the M4, which serves as butler, housekeeper, gardener, and as you are fully aware of, guardian." Captain Kirk would state, "A most impressive home, Mr. Flint." Dr. McCoy would add, "Yes, Shakespeare's first folio, the Gutenberg Bible, creation of lithographs by Tara Nollis of Centaur 7. This is the most impressive book collections in the galaxy, spanning centuries." In response, Mr. Flint would smile politely and state, "Be comfortable, gentlemen. Help yourselves to brandy." Unaware that they were being monitored, we would see Raina for the first time as she watched the screen showing the landing party, as well as hearing their conversations. When Flint left the room, Dr. McCoy asked, "Should we trust him?" Mr. Spock would reply, "It would seem logical to do so for the moment." Dr. McCoy would then inform the captain that his time was down to 2 hours needed to refine the raw Ritalin into the serum formula. Mr. Spock would marvel at the paintings and stating that it would be the most splendid collection of art he had ever seen, as well as being the most unique. The majority of the works of Leonardo da Vinci, Renaissance period, some of the works of Reginald Pollock, 20th century, and even a stem from Marcus II. Meanwhile, in another room, Raina would say to Flint, "Finally, at last, I see other humans." Flint would correct her by saying, "Other men." Raina would say, "One is not human." Flint would say, "The Vulcan." And she would say, "So that is a Vulcan. I would like to discuss sub-dimensional physics with him. You taught me all you know, and you say Vulcans know more." Flint would respond by saying, "Even he is not your intellectual equal, nor mine." Raina would ask to meet them. Flint would shake his head responding, "They are selfish, brutal, a part of humanity and the community of it I have rejected and have shielded you from." Raina pressed, saying, "Soon they will be gone. Let me see them." Flint tried to kiss Raina, and she did not respond in any way. He then asked her if she were lonely. She would ask, "What is loneliness?" She would later say it would be exciting to meet them. Flint had said that she had never demanded anything from him before, and he would allow Raina to meet Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy. We see Dr. McCoy looking at a bottle stating Saurian brandy, 100 years old. "Jim?" Captain Kirk would reply, "Please." McCoy would then say to Spock, "Mr. Spock, I know you won't have one. Heaven forbid those mathematically perfect brainwaves be corrupted by this all-too-human vice." To their surprise, Mr. Spock would reply, "Thank you, Doctor. I will have a brandy." Dr. McCoy would look at Captain Kirk and say, "Do you think the two of us can handle a drunk Vulcan?" Once that alcohol hits his green blood, Mr. Spock would approach the table, stating that if he appeared distracted, it is by what he has seen. He went on to say that he was close to experiencing an unaccustomed emotion. Dr. McCoy stated that he will drink to that, and then he asked Spock, "What emotion?" Mr. Spock replied, "Envy." None of these Da Vinci paintings has ever been cataloged or reproduced. They are unknown works, apparently authentic to the last brushstroke and the use of materials. He went on to say, as undiscovered Da Vinci's, they would be priceless. Kirk asked if he thought they were fakes. Spock said that a man of Flint's wealth and taste would hardly need to put up fakes. He then stated that everything was created using canvas and pigments of contemporary origin. Kirk would later say that they could be real or they could be an illusion. He then told him to take tricorder readings at his earliest opportunity to see if Flint was in fact human. Kirk would then contact the Enterprise and ask Mr. Scott to run a full check on Mr. Flint, as well as planet Holberg 917G. As the landing party enjoyed the Saurian brandy, the M4 unit would come in and drop a bag of Ritalin on the table. Upon scanning, Dr. McCoy said it was Ritalin ready for processing. Kirk told him to beam up to the ship and get started. Mr. Flint entered the room stating that it wasn't necessary and that the M4 could process the Ritalin in his lab faster than they could aboard ship. Dr. McCoy asked to supervise the operation. Agreeing, Flint said, and upon completion, he would appreciate the landing party staying for dinner. He said he regretted his earlier inhospitality. He then introduced the landing party to Reyna. He later stated that he meant the outside of his family. Other than that, he was alone on the planet. Flint introduced Reyna to Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Spock. When Reyna was introduced to Mr. Spock, she said that she had hoped that they would have an opportunity to discuss field density and its relationship to gravity phenomenon. Spock responded, "Indeed, I would appreciate such a talk. It is an interest of mine." Flint would later say of Reyna, "Her parents were killed in an accident during my employ. Before dying, they placed their infant Reyna Kopik in my custody. I have raised and educated her." McCoy would then say, "With most impressive results, sir." Flint would later say that Reyna possessed the equivalent of 17 university degrees in the sciences and arts. She is aware that the intellect is not all. Dr. McCoy would later tell Reyna that she was the furthest thing from a bookworm he has ever seen. She went on to say that Flint was her teacher. She also said that the landing party was in fact the first men she had ever seen. To this, Dr. McCoy stated, "The misfortune of men everywhere, and our privilege." Dr. McCoy would later accompany the M4 to Flint's laboratory to process the Ritalin. In the meantime, Captain Kirk would get to know Reyna more by playing a game of billiards with her. He was amazed at her skills and knowledge of the game. Later on, Flint would hear the piano notes coming from the other room, and he would look and see Mr. Spock with the sheet music. Flint would encourage him to play the waltz. Captain Kirk would then ask Reyna to dance. It was obvious that Captain Kirk was very fond of the young lady. While they were dancing over in the lab, the M4 would present the refined Ritalin to Dr. McCoy. He would head back to the parlor where Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock were and inform them that the Ritalin was useless. It contained iridium, which would render the Ritalin inert. Flint would immediately apologize and have the M4 gather more. He said he would accompany the M4 and welcome Dr. McCoy to join him. McCoy informed the captain of the growing urgency of the situation. When McCoy, Flint, and the M4 left, Spock noticed that the music he played was authentic and by Johannes Brahms, yet it was an unknown piece of work. Captain Kirk would head to the laboratory and instruct Mr. Spock to stay in the parlor and let him know when McCoy and Flint returned. Later in the lab, Kirk had seen Reyna. She came in, and she went to a door that led to another room. She stopped and looked at it, and he asked what was in there. She said she did not know. It was the only thing that Flint forbade her from doing. Captain Kirk would ask her if she was happy and told Reyna not to be afraid. He then kissed her and hugged her, and that is when the M4 was going to attack Captain Kirk. Fortunately, Mr. Spock would come from behind and use his phaser on it, destroying the M4 unit. It had not detected him, therefore did not deactivate Mr. Spock's phaser. Later, Flint would introduce a new M4 unit, saying that they are much too useful a device to not have around. He told Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk that the Ritalin was ready and that he should wait in the parlor. Once he and Reyna left, Captain Kirk said he did not like the way he orders her around. Spock later would tell Kirk that he thought Flint had an interest in Rayna. Kirk asked if he loved her, and Mr. Spock agreed. This surprised the captain. At that point, Kirk checked in with the Enterprise, and Mr. Scott said that nearly all of the crew had the Rigelian fever, and that the ship was being run by a skeleton crew. Lieutenant Uhura let the captain know that there was no record of Mr. Flint at all. He then asked her to run a check on Rayna Kopek. Mr. Spock told the captain that he was able to run a tricorder scan on Flint. He said that he was human, but there were certain biophysical peculiarities. Some body function readings were off and disappropriate. He went on to say that extreme age was indicated, some 6,000 years. Mr. Scott would later inform Captain Kirk that there was no record at all of a Rayna Kopek anywhere in the computer, just like Flint's. When Rayna came to say goodbye to the landing party, Kirk would kiss her. She would then kiss him back. While watching on a monitor, Flint appeared to be upset as jealousy took hold. Kirk would ask her to go with him, stating that she loved him and not Flint. The M4 would disappear and take the right Talon with it, irritating Dr. McCoy. He would inform Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk, so they would go to the lab to investigate. Mr. Spock's tricorder showed that the right Talon was in the room that Flint forbade Rayna from going into. After the door in the room opened, Mr. Spock immediately stepped in front of Kirk, saying that he would go in due to unforeseen dangers. After all three entered the room, they finally found the right Talon. Then they entered another room that had bodies upon multiple tables. There were small tabs that were numbered that read Rayna. Kirk began to realize that Rayna was an android. Flint would later acknowledge that he was Brahms and Da Vinci, as well as Solomon, Alexander, Lazarus, Methuselah, Marilyn, Abrahamson, and 100 others you do not know. He later says he is human, born in the part of Earth known as Mesopotamia in the year 3834 BC. He later spoke of being immortal, while having to live part of his life and move on before he was suspected. Mr. Spock later said that Flint created the perfect woman and mate as brilliant and immortal as he was. He told Kirk that she was for him, made from the heart, and he could not love her more. Kirk asked him if she knew. Flint replied that she would never know. He later said to the landing party that they could not leave now. Mr. Spock added that they found out what he is. Flint would use a small device to pull the Enterprise out of orbit, and it would appear on a table in a room where they stood. Kirk was helpless as he peered into the ship through the view screen. Flint said that they were not dead, only suspended. Kirk replied, "Worse than dead." He would implore Flint to restore his ship and crew. Flint said that he would release the Enterprise in 1,000 or 2,000 years, and that Kirk would know the future. Of course, this did not sit well with Captain Kirk. Dr. McCoy would then add, "You have been such men. You have known and created such beauty. You watched your race grow from cruelty and barbarism throughout your enormous life, and yet now you would do this to us." Flint would later profess his needs, which were revealed to be Rayna's stirring emotions and a love for him. He planned on Rayna's falling in love with him as much as he loved her. She would enter the room and show displeasure at Flint's plan to hold the Enterprise and her crew. After Mr. Spock asked her what she would feel for Flint after they were suspended, her look said it all. Dr. McCoy added that all the emotions are in play now. You hurt us and she hates you. Captain Kirk would demand his ship back, and that his secret would be safe with them. Flint would use the remote control to restore the Enterprise to her orbit. Kirk would add everything up and state to Flint that he knew his presence would stir Rayna's emotions, and that he in fact used him. Flint said it was impossible for Kirk to love Rayna, and that she was like him. Both of them were immortal, and they were mated. Kirk responded that he couldn't love her, but he did love her, and then added, "And she loves me." Upon hearing this, Flint became furious and attacked Captain Kirk. Mr. Spock tried to dissuade him, but he told him to keep out of it. He added that they were fighting for a woman, to which immediately Mr. Spock said, "No, you are not, for she is not." Rayna was visibly upset at the fighting men. She did not want to be the cause of this. "I choose," she went on to say. "No one can order me." Faced with being asked to join Captain Kirk or stay with Flint, she would eventually collapse and cease to exist. It would be Spock that would explain that she loved Captain Kirk and loved Flint, but she loved Flint more as a mentor and father figure. "She could not bear to hurt either of you," Mr. Spock said. "It was the emotion of love that made her human, and the power of love that destroyed her." Later aboard the Enterprise, Mr. Spock would report to Captain Kirk that the epidemic was in control and no longer a problem. He added that the ship was back on course 513 Mark 7 as ordered. Kirk was visibly dejected. He said to Spock, "A very old and lonely man, and a young and lonely man. We put on a pretty poor show, didn't we? If only I could forget." The captain would then rest his head on the desk and fall asleep. Dr. McCoy would enter with news, and he would be quieted down by Mr. Spock immediately. He told Spock that the tricorder readings correlated and said that by leaving Earth, Mr. Flint sacrificed his immortality, and that he would age normally and eventually die. He informed Mr. Spock that he did tell Mr. Flint the news. Dr. McCoy would leave the room, leaving Kirk and Spock alone. That is when Mr. Spock would lean down over the sleeping Captain Kirk and touch the side of his head and utter the word, "Forget."